Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time you are watching this. This lecture is not exhaustive, but it is trying to provide a good overview and supplement and give you background information that connects with the readings for this week and readings to come. So today we're going to embark upon a journey through the history of American education from its colonial roots to the transformative decades of the mid 20th century. Let's see, I think I don't. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to see what best does with the video. So anyway, as we explore this timeline, we'll draw insights from Joel Spring's work, particularly his examination of the globalization and religion in colonial education. We will also examine how Spring reminds us of the earliest forms of American schooling that were and that there were not isolated events, but rather a product of global influences and deeply intertwined religious motivations. This initial foundation, heavily shaped by the transplantation of European ideas and the dominant religious ideologies of the time, set the stage for persistent struggles of equity and the evolving purpose of education and ongoing cycles of reform that we will trace through the centuries. So our agenda today is we will be covering the colonial area, the post-revolutionary area, the common school area, Civil War and Reconstruction, industrialization and immigration, segregation and inequality, and that will bring us up to the 60s of civil rights and the post-war reform. There will be another lecture later that goes into more detail from the 60s on, okay? Our learning objectives are self-explanatory. I will give you a few minutes to read those to yourselves and think about those. All right. So the first era we're going to explore is the colonial era beginning from the 1600s to 1776. And so we want to think about the religious key influences here are the religious motivations, European models, and economic social needs. So when we're talking about religious motivations, we're talking about the Puritanism in New England, the Puritan value system, which set up why and how we do a lot of things, even in present day. Emphasis on literacy for religious instruction. So reading was coming from the Bible was their tool and their instrument or their text. Other religious dominations like the Quakers and the Anglicans had various approaches to education. We see influence of religious texts and doctrine on the curriculum as well as pedagogy. In the European models, we see the transplanted European educational ideas and institutions like grammar schools and apprenticeships transformed and become part of our early educational system. We all see also see social class distinctions that were also reflected in European models and early educational opportunities. As for economic and social needs, there is a basic need for literacy and numeracy for people to be able to do daily activities and trade. Apprenticeship was the primary form of vocational training where you worked alongside a person and with a person and learned the craft and the tools. Differing educational priorities were based on geographic regions or social structure, such as the plantation life in the South and the difference of New England hometowns and town sets. When we're looking at the key policies and practices, we see the early forms of schooling included dame schools, which were informal education that provided by women in their homes. We had see certain towns offered schools. There are publicly supported schools in the New England towns thanks to Massachusetts school laws. We see the onset of grammar schools, which was preparation for college. Primarily, this was offered to boys with a privileged background or elite background. We see also the apprenticeship system where people began to learn through practical experiences, a trade such as carpentry, masonry, blacksmith, things like that. When we're thinking about the curriculum and the pedagogy, emphasis on religious instruction, reading, writing, and basic arithmetic were part of the structure. Authoritarian teaching methods and rote memorization and discipline were part of the methodology and the instructional strategies used. We see limited resources and not a very diverse population within a single classroom background. As far as diversity and inequality, we see limited educational opportunities for girls, enslaved Africans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian uh, Americans. We also see a varying access to education based on an individual's social class, their religious background, and or their geographic location. One of the early things when we think about educational philosophy for the colonial times is, as said earlier, it was grounded in religious instruction. That was the central and primary force. Children were seen as born evil, and this concept that we need to indoctrinate them and help them not to be evil. This moral development, instilling moral character and social order, using education and schooling as the means of that. In social hierarchy, we see education was often reinforced to reinforce existing social hierarchies of class and limit social mobility to certain groups and certain individuals. As for the local control, education was largely primarily a local responsibility, varying in degrees with community involvement, but it was a town specific or city specific or state specific. When we think about the post-revolutionary period from 1776 to 1830, some of the key influences was this concept because we were a new nation. Education for the new republic is the concept that we need to think about. And so when we're thinking about that, we need to think about how nationalism and civic virtue, these desire to create informed citizens for the new republic. The Enlightenment ideals emphasize the concept of reason, individual rights, and the importance of education for a functioning democracy. Early republicanism was the belief in the virtuous citizenry as an essential for service to the new republic and the republic's continued success. There was limited central government because education was largely a state and local responsibility in the early forms of education. When we look at key policies and practice, we see certain states including in their constitutions provisions for education, even though it was still very vague. We see certain federal land grants and land ordinances to support education in new territories, such as the Massachusetts school laws of 1642 and 1647, where early legislative efforts in New England to mandate literacy and education, reflecting strong Puritan emphasis on reading the Bible. And the 1967 law required towns of a certain size to establish grammar schools. We have private academies began to grow for secondary schooling for elite citizens. Elementary schools were typically locally funded and often inconsistent in their quality and availability. As I mentioned earlier, we had the dame schools, which were informal and usually conducted by women in their homes and provided basic literacy instruction to young children. Like a widow may be teaching local children their letters or basic reading skills. As for grammar schools, secondary schools were designed to prepare boys for college, focusing on classical language and literature. The Boston Latin School, which emphasized Latin and Greek, is a good example of this. In terms of thinking about educational philosophy for this time period, we want to focus on looking at the role of the student, the role of the teacher, and the sample curriculum. I'm not going to read that to you because I've put that up. But when you think about perennialism, which is one form of educational philosophy that grounds itself in this concept of one truth, one way of being, one way of knowing. A lot of times, this time period is categorized as a perennialist kind of form mentality about schooling. When you look at how the teacher is supposed to be instilling patriotism and transmitting moral values, and the main role for students is to become these virtuous, wondrous citizens to help the new nation form. The rise of the common school. The common school took place between 1830 to 1860. The Jacksonian democracy is really explaining or discussing the expansion of suffrage and the belief in equality for opportunity, but it was specifically equality and opportunity for all white males. Women, non-white identified males were not considered into this category. When we think about industrialization and urbanization, there was a need for more disciplined and literate workforce because we were becoming a little bit more um, company oriented, factory oriented, and people needed to have more literate skills. We also have issues of immigration where we were using schools to Americanize our more diverse populations that were coming in. We also had various social reforms begin at this time where education could be seen as a tool to create social uplift and social order and reduce crime. From the leadership of Horace Mann and others like him, we have this concentration of talking about and advocating for universal and free and non-sectarian public education. So for the first time in history, we have this concept of how we can provide public education that's universal for all and hopefully non-sectarian. But we know the common schools were grounded in the Protestant value system, which caused problems later on for those who were Catholic and not Protestant. Some of the key policies and practices from this time point is the establishment of state-supported common schools, tax-funded public schools open to all white children, okay? Standardization efforts where we see creating a uniform curriculum, teacher training programs were taking place in the normal schools, and the school organization and the school facility, everything was standardized. We also see the emergence of teacher training programs in the normal schools that professionalize the concept of teaching. And we see the growth of various school districts and consolidating local schools under a district administration. And finally, we continue to see this emphasis on moral education, instilling common values and social order, and using schools to instill concepts like punctuality, obedience, and other values that were deemed for an industrial society at the time. When we think about the educational philosophy, this is when we start pulling out not just the teacher role and the student role and curriculum, but actual ways of being and thinking. So from the Republicanist standpoint, we are thinking about education for citizenship and the preservation of democratic ideals. So within the context of that time. So republicanism is education for citizenship and the preservation of democratic ideals within this time frame. Unitarianism is the emphasis on practical belief benefits of education for the individual or the society. And nationalism is fostering a sense of national identity and patriotism. And moralism is the strong emphasis on character development and the inculcation of the Protestant based morality, often presented as non sectarian. Okay. So republicanism is the education for citizenship and the preservation of democratic ideals within this time frame. Unitarianism is the emphasis on practical benefits of education for the individual and society. Nationalism, fostering a sense of national identity and patriotism. And moralism, strong emphasis on character development and the inculcation of the Protestant-based morality. Okay. Now, in the Civil War area, we see a disruption of existing education systems, particularly in the South. Emancipation was the need for newly educated, freed Africans to be educated and become literate. We saw in one of the films that there was a whole lot of people that really, really were thriving and wanted to become literate. We see the reconstruction of certain amendments that established civil rights and opportunities for African Americans, women, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and others. We see the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal agency that played a significant role in establishing schools for African Americans in the South. We see resistance to Black education, where to white Southern opposition to educating formally enslaved people, and still this concept of not seeing them as human beings, and all of those kind of things. We see in our key policies in this time period that the establishment of schools for African Americans and other non-whites was flourishing at this time. We often saw support from Northern missionary societies and the Freedmen's Bureau, which were specifically set up to help with this. We see a limited progress toward integration. Segregation seemed to be a widespread process when we think about living as well as school and interacting. There was a focus on basic literacy for the freedmen, providing essential skills for survival and participation in society. And we also see the rebuilding of the Southern school system. Um, but the progress was slow and uneven and often underfunded. As we look at the philosophy, we see the teachers' roles, because this was a time when they were trying to figure out, what are we going to do with the newly freed Africans? What are we going to do with the whites? And how do we bring these folks together? And so that is another reason why segregation was so entrenched. And we'll get into later talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, which gave doctrine to have separate but equal facilities. Um, but this is pretty self-explanatory. So when we look at the industrial and immigration era of 1880 to 1920s, we see rapid industrialization in this age of industry and immigration, and a demand for skilled and disciplined industrial workforce. We see an influx of Southern, Eastern immigrants and more diverse populations of immigration coming through. We see a growth of the cities and the urbanization and the challenges of educating large, diverse student populations. In the progressive area form, we see a focus on social justice, efficiency, and social control through schools, and the influences of psychology and social science, where we start really trying to have conversations, thanks to progressivism, have conversations about child development and social organizations, and centering curriculum and schooling around the student versus just the teacher center or society center. We also have an expansion of high school. Secondary education begins to grow because of the industrial economy growing. The concept of vocational education and the development of programs to train students for specific industrial jobs begins to grow. We also see lots of Americanization programs with efforts to assimilate immigrant children into American culture and American life, English only programs, things like that. We see an increase in states requiring school attendance in education and compulsory laws, and also trying to combat child labor issues. And we see a beginning of differentiation and tracking, sorting students into different educational paths as perceived by their abilities or future woes that we are putting upon them. And in the educational policy, we see pragmatism, which is a Dewey kind of thing, where emphasis on experiential learning, student-centered education, and the social role of schooling. Some people also call this progressivism. Social efficiency, where we are focusing on preparing students for their roles in the industrial economy and maintaining the social order. Some people call this Taylorism as well. Developmentalism, where we, like we talked about in the slide before, psychologists and things are thinking about students' cognitive and social emotional development of children and how that impacts their learning and ways of knowing. And then we see an increasing attention start to be thinking about how we grow educational opportunities for students regardless of their race, class, or their gender. We see more conversations beginning to think about this and talk about this, but they still won't solve all the problems yet. Segregation and inequality. Like I mentioned before, we have Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which legalized the separate but equal doctrine and reinforced segregation for the time. Jim Crow laws were systematic segregation and discriminatory acts and laws against African Americans in all aspects of life, including their education. We had racial prejudice and discrimination, deep-seated social beliefs and white supremacy taking place at this time. We see activism and resistance from African Americans, Mexican Americans, others, communities establish and maintaining their own schools and fighting for equal rights. We see an underfunding of schools, not just for Blacks, but any school that was a non-white school suffered with resources and facilities being less than those in the white schools. Segregated schools were legally mandated and which is de jure, whereas de facto segregation, which is continuing to take place in our country today, is not legalized. We have unequal funding, still consistent. Black schools, non-white schools receive fewer resources. Their teachers were paid lower salaries, and their facilities sometimes were inadequate. We also see a limited curriculum taking place in Black schools that focus primarily on basic education or vocational or industrial skills, with fewer opportunities for academic advancement in graduate schools or professional fields or things like that. I think it's the Bell Hooks text we read where there were three options. You could be a teacher, you could get married, and I can forget what the third option was, but it wasn't that many options afforded to women and especially women of color at this time, or even people of color in general. We see the establishment of Black colleges and universities, crucial institutions that provided higher education opportunities for African Americans despite the systemic barriers. Tuskegee Institute was one of them, Hampton, and other institutes. From a standpoint of the philosophy, we see, you can read that, we see that there's a difference that was taking place in the Black schools versus the white schools and the curriculum. We also know that the curriculum for non-whites was very limited and not as comprehensive or higher ed oriented as in some of the other locations. The dawn of reform, challenging inequality. So we have Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the 1954 Supreme Court ruling that declared that state-sponsored segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. We also had Brown two, I believe, come in 1955, and they used the doctrine with all deliberate speed. And that is why schools did not start desegregating until my school years of the 70s. So, and even here we are in 2025, and we still If we tally certain schools in certain neighborhoods, they are still highly segregated. And when we examine the resources, um, Brown was never fully implemented, basically. And there was continued pushback on that. We have the civil rights movement, which was growing activism and legal challenges against issues of segregation and discrimination. We have remnants of the Cold War, which emphasized national unity and the need to address racial inequality uh, to a project for a positive, abroad looking, but we still have issues. And this is where we have certain laws like education as a matter of national defense. And we started to increase what we did with the sciences and math, foreign language was being offered, more teacher training and tracking, and money started highly going toward the space race, NASA, Sputnik, things like that. This is also a time where we saw increased federal involvement, the growing recognition of federal government's role in ensuring that equal opportunity education. We have the Civil Rights Bill. We have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So there was a lot of things that came about to try to ensure more equality and educational opportunity for all. We had social and political pressures, public awareness, and outcry about the injustices and segregation. Desegregation efforts were gradual but resisted to implementation. Like I told you, even though Brown was signed in 54, Brown 2 came in 55, and then here we looked at, we were in the 60s and we still had successfully desegregated schools. And that's when busing came. So early federal legislation, we had initial federal laws aimed at promoting civil rights and educational equality in schools. We had an increased focus on issues of equity and the awareness to address certain disparities and outcomes that were taking place in the schools. But we also saw curriculum efforts to provide more diverse perspectives and to begin starting the early initial curriculum reforms towards social justice and making sure that we are talking about not just white men, dead white men, the grandmaster narrative, but trying to include voices of women, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and others. Okay. Educational philosophy at this time, we're when we think about it, it's the student's role, but we also start, this is some of the emergence of some critical pedagogy, even though it wasn't called that. This is also the emergence of thinking about how we connect schools to society and those kind of things. And that was a continued process for schools. When we think about the desegregation and equal opportunity, the landmark decision of Brown grounded in the principle of equal protection under the law, but fundamentally challenged the philosophy of secular equal. The driving philosophy was that all students, regardless of race, deserved equal access to quality education and the opportunity to reach their full potential. This era saw the onset of this philosophy of educational justice and demanding the dismantling of systematic barriers that created racial inequality in schools. When we look at progressive education, we see a renewed focus on social justice. While progressive education had earlier iterations, the civil rights era, there was a stronger emphasis emerged on the potential of fostering critical thinking, social awareness, and democratic participation among all students. Philosophers like John Dewey's ideas about experiential learning and education for democratic citizenship were reinterpreted through the lens of racial equality and social change. Some progressive educators saw schooling as a vehicle for social reconstruction, believing education should actively work to address social inequalities. And critical pedagogy was emerging, like I told you. We see the early seeds of critical pedagogy, later popularized by figures like Paulo Freire, began to influence some educational thinkers. This philosophy emphasized the role of education in empowering marginalized students to understand and challenge oppressive social structures. It also stressed the importance of critical consciousness and connecting knowledge to power dynamics and social action. When we think about compensatory education, with the growing recognition of the educational disadvantage faced by marginalized students due to historical and ongoing discrimination, the philosophy of compensatory education gained traction. This approach advocated for providing additional resources and support to these students to help them overcome these disadvantages and achieve educational equity. As I mentioned earlier, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 reflected this philosophy through Title I funding aimed at supporting disadvantaged students. As we think about integration and inclusion, beyond simply desegregating schools, a developing philosophy of integration aimed at creating truly inclusive environments where students from diverse backgrounds learn together and were equally valued. This went beyond physical proximity to encompass social, emotional, and academic inclusion. The philosophy of inclusion emphasized the importance of creating a sense of belonging for all students, respecting their differences, and providing the necessary support for their success. And the final bullet and philosophy I want to talk about is humanistic education. This philosophy emphasizes the inherent worth and potential of each individual, gained prominence in the post-war era, and it stressed the importance of fostering student self-esteem, creativity, and personal growth, while aligning with the desire to create more nurturing and equitable school environments for all children, regardless of their background. So, in summary, the educational philosophies of the civil rights and post war reform were heavily shaped by the struggle for racial inequality and social justice. They emphasized equal opportunity and potential of education for social change, the need to address historical inequities, and the importance of creating inclusive and humanizing learning environments for all students. This period laid the philosophical groundwork for many of the equity focused educational reforms that continue to be debated and implemented today. In conclusion, let's talk about these four things. So, the transformations of schooling, we have the colonial beginnings that emphasize the local, religious driven, and often informal nature of early schooling, like the dame schools, town schools, primarily religious literacy. They highlighted the transplantation of European models, such as the grammar schools for elite students. We have the rise of the common school and transformations of schooling that discuss the shifts towards state-supported, more standardized public education for white children, driven by nationalism, industrialization, and social reform. And our key figure for this is Horace Mann. Expansion of diversification is also a transformation of schooling where we covered the growth when we think about high schools and the emergence of vocational education and the increasing influence of federal involvement, particularly post-World War II with the National Defense for Education Act in 1958. Pedagogical shifts briefly touch upon changes in teaching methods. We have teaching methods change from rote memorization and strict discipline to more progressive approaches that were even unevenly implemented. For persistent struggles for equity and access to schooling, we have colonial exclusions, where we see the highlight of non-existent educational opportunities for enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and those identified as female or girls. Common school limitations pointed out the common school initially excluded many, particularly African Americans and often recent immigrants of Southern Eastern backgrounds, and faced regional disparities. The segregation era emphasized the legally enforced and deeply entrenched segregation of African Americans and often Latinos and Asian Americans with vast inequalities in resources and qualities, and the impact of Plessy versus Ferguson saying that separate but equal was okay. We have unequal opportunities with the expansion of schooling. We see persistent disparities by race, class, gender, and geographic locations because that shaped access and quality to education. We see early seeds of change with activism and legal challenges that began to address these inequities, setting the stage for the civil rights era. And issues of debate and education, purpose and role. The colonial focus primarily was often religious instruction and moral development. The common schools were argued for and against, even though they were trying to create a unified citizenry, impact the social order, and work on economic opportunity. Only for some, not for all. Industrial era debates highlighted the tension between education for assimilation, vocational training for the workforce, and broader academic pursuits. Segregation era conflicts, the fundamental debate centered on inherent inequality and injustice of segregated education versus the fight for equality and equal opportunity. Post-war reassessment, the purpose of education began to be linked to national competitiveness in the Cold War and the ideas of more than just being an equitable, of a more just and equitable society as we see in the civil rights era. And finally, early educational reforms. We have Horace Mann's advocacy for free universal schooling, established the first state-supported schools, and teacher training became formalized as the significance of this era. Schools aimed to moralize and standardize students' behaviors, and schools also became tools for Americanization of immigrants. In the progressive era reforms, the aim was to create learning experiences that are more relevant and engaging to students, that emphasize active learning, critical thinking, collaboration, experiential learning, and democracy. And additionally, to make education more efficient and relevant to industrial needs and socially just, even though it still had limitations and biases. In the post Sputnik reform, the late 50s highlights the focus on science, math, foreign language in response to the Cold War and National Defense Education Act, NDEA, of 1958. We also have federal goals and promoting of higher education as a goal for enhancing our science and technology. And the civil rights era, the early stages during the Civil War and Reconstruction, we had the Freedmen's Bureau that supported education for freed enslaved Africans. And we have education seen as liberation and a civil right. And we see the landmark decision of Brown versus the Board of Education as a catalyst for desegregation, even though implementation was slow and met with continued resistance. Our ongoing efforts, the history of American education, is one of the continuous reform efforts and aimed at addressing evolving societal needs and persistent inequalities. Thank you, and I hope this was helpful. Take care.